this could be simply the basic right that everyone would have by birth. But in Syria, remember, throughout the 61 years of Ba'ath regime and 54 years of Assad family's rule, Kurds did not have the full citizenship. They were given the permanent residency in this country. And indeed, that was one of the reasons that at first hand, when the Arab Spring started in Syria, Kurds rebelled against Damascus. Now, the new administration is saying that Kurds are going to have their full citizenship, rights of full citizenship, and also all the constitutional rights. So here, it's not clear, however, whether this is going to be an autonomy, a semi-autonomy, or a special status. However, we understand that now they're going to have a constitutional status. It's not clear whether this is going to be a model that is resembling of the Kurdish status in the north of Iraq or not. However, this is still a major challenge. And also, now SDF is guaranteeing that it's going to join the fight against the remnants of the old regime with the Syrian administration here. And now they're saying that a committee is formed, and that committee is going to implement the agreement no later than the end of the current year. So it means that within 9 months, this agreement is going to be implemented gradually. This is quite significant, maybe a new chapter for Syria.
A new chapter indeed, Resul. Many thanks for that, Resul Serdar in Damascus there. Let's go to Heidi Zhou-Castro now, who's in Washington, D.C. for us. And Heidi, an agreement, potential at least, it still needs to be implemented, not without consequences for the United States, who have been backing the SDF in their fight against ISIL for many years.
That's right, and we're still waiting for an official response from the U.S. government, but all signs are pointing that this will be a very welcome development here in Washington because, as you said, the U.S. has been the SDF's major backer since the group's formation. And even now, the U.S. CENTCOM commander, Michael Corrella, was in the region meeting with SDF leaders and touting a series of progress that they're making as the two continue to fight against ISIL, announcing the capture of an ISIL cell leader recently. The U.S. upped the number of U.S. troops in Syria after the fall of Assad. That went from 900 troops to now 2,000 who are still currently in country. And the question really has been how much longer the U.S. will maintain its troops, given that now President Trump has said he is considering withdrawing and that could be a timeline of sometime between 30 to 90 days. What does this most recent development with the SDF now agreeing to join the Syrian government mean to all of that? Those are the questions that the U.S. will be asking, as well as the U.S. is really focused on the continued fight against ISIL. And certainly will be wondering whether the SDF will continue to partner with the U.S., not wanting to give ground to a resurgence of ISIL in the region.
Heidi Zhou-Castro there in Washington, D.C. Many thanks for that. Well, let's take a look at the areas the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, actually control. Their stronghold in eastern Syria includes large oil fields and U.S. bases. The SDF dismantled ISIL's final stronghold in Raqqa city in eastern Syria in 2017, that with U.S. backing. U.S. troops have been stationed in the region ever since to help prevent the resurgence of ISIL. But Türkiye considers the SDF's Kurdish factions to be terrorist groups due to alleged ties with the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Kayaoğlu is a political analyst. He joins us from Ankara to talk about this in a bit more detail. Welcome to Al Jazeera. So how might this merger of Kurdish-led forces, the control, as I said, large swathes of northeast Syria, work within the context of this new fledgling Syrian leadership?
Thanks for having me on your show. It's a very good question. And the one advantage of this deal is that it gets the pressure off the SDF and its so-called autonomous administration of northeast Syria that it's been running with U.S. backing, as you and the previous commentators mentioned. But it also removes some pressure off of Ankara's back. For years, the SDF was, with some good cause, was perceived as the continuation of the Kurdish armed militant group PKK, in large part because the leader of the SDF Muslim Kobani, Muslim Abdi, was something of an honorary child, an honorary son of the founder of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, whom, as you mentioned, as you alluded to, called for a laying down of arms of the PKK. He called on his organization to lay down its arms against the Turkish state with no conditions, without any conditions. And there's been some debate since then. It's been almost 2 weeks since Öcalan made this call of whether not only the PKK, but what us Turks perceive as the PKK Syrian branch, the SDF, should also be laying down its arms against the Turkish state. This agreement with the central government in Damascus, between the SDF and the central government in Damascus, led by President Ahmed al-Shara, really gets the pressure off. Now, the two sides, the many sides actually, can sit down and actually work on some of the finer details of what the new Syria will look like, right, how Türkiye will be approaching northeastern Syria.
Okay, let me jump in there, because you've hinted at all sorts of concessions that have been made by Kurdish groups, both in Türkiye and Syria, in recent months. You mentioned Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, calling on forces to lay down their arms. Now you've got the SDF in Syria saying that they'll work together with the emerging Syrian leadership. We must be talking about huge concessions, compensation, economic, military, territorial, when it comes to Kurds across the region for doing something like this, surely?
Absolutely. Your reporter, I believe, in Damascus mentioned this. He alluded to the Kurdistan regional government of Iraq, where I lived for almost 8 years in a previous life. And one of the arrangements that in 2005 with the Kurds and the new administration in Baghdad, under the new constitution, was to divvy up the country's oil and gas resources among the different provinces, but specifically between the federal government in Baghdad and the Kurdish region. And a similar arrangement, I believe, had been in the works between the interim government in Syria under President Shara and the SDF and the Syrian Kurds. And I believe that quite a few of those issues at least have been resolved, or at least they have agreed on a framework in which they can actually work out these differences.
Of course, there needs to be a political framework, doesn't there, as well, if any of this is going to be working successfully within the context of a fully functioning democracy, if that is indeed the direction that Syria is going. Some have talked about the political model of Lebanon possibly being something that we may well see emerge in Syria as well. What do you make of that?
Yes, there's been some talk, although I don't think either Syrians, and I should say quite a few Lebanese would agree with the logic behind it, because I mentioned Iraq. One of the governance problems that both Iraq and Lebanon have been facing in the last decades is the notion of consociationalism, which is that certain ethno-religious groups are allocated certain government seats. In the case of Lebanon, the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, the parliament speaker is Shia Muslim, so on and so forth. And you have similar arrangements in Iraq. I don't know if they really would like, maybe in a brief transitional 5-10 year period, yes. But in the long term, I'm not sure if Syrians would be for that sort of a system, because the Lebanese folks themselves often complain about reserved seats and not really having a full equal before the law citizenship type of political legal arrangement in their country. But, certain things can definitely be worked out. And obviously, as your reporter in Damascus mentioned, there's a sense that for years, until really the civil war, the Assad regime had denied Kurds, never mind passports and whatnot, but even a recognition of issuing ID cards to them. So even overcoming those sorts of obstacles would go a huge way. Then, which minister is going to be from which ethno-sectarian group. I believe having proper citizenship is the more important and the harder step, honestly.
It is a hugely important moment in the next step in this emerging Syria. Baron Kayaoğlu, pleasure to have you on Al Jazeera. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.